The year is 2007. I am 10 years old. There are 2 games coming out this year that I'm super excited to play. They will color my sense of myself as a gamer, or maybe as not a gamer, for many years to come, though of course I don't know that yet. These games are Assassin's Creed and Call of Duty Modern Warfare. I play them both on my brother's PlayStation 3 in a small countryside English town. A town where my family is very obviously different, and people love to make it known to us. To make subtext text, contrary to the belief of at least one YouTube commenter, this is because I am, in fact, not white. There's an especially strong whiff of Islamophobia in the air during these first 10 years of my life. Of course, it never really goes away, but in those days it hung in the air like the smell of cow manure on the drive to school. I heard about these big political events on TV or on the radio or in the grandiose conversations of adults, but I didn't really understand what anyone was talking about. 9/11, the War on Terror, Iraq and Afghanistan, the 7/7 bombings. I did have a sense that somehow me and my family were being held responsible for these things, with everything from subtle exclusions to dirty looks to all-out cries of terrorist or Paki, and even the occasional touch of physical harassment. Over a decade later, I would of course become more attuned to the finer points of racism that underpin a game like the first Assassin's Creed. As a kid, I was just really excited to play as an Arab guy running around rich and vibrant cities full of brown people and beautiful Islamic architecture. I'll come back to that in another video, but for now I'm interested in the likes of Call of Duty Modern Warfare.
Your fruit killing skills are remarkable.
In this video, I'm interested in games where shooting at Arabs makes you a hero. Even at 10 years old, I knew that made me uncomfortable, and I probably knew, on some level, that it had something to do with the names they called me at school. Hi, and welcome to Game Assist. I'm Sara, my pronouns are they, them, and she, her. Before we dive into this video essay, make sure you're subscribed and have the notification bell turned on to find out when we post. If you really like what we do, consider joining our Patreon community. We have rewards from just £1 a month, and it helps us to keep doing what we're doing. Alternatively, if a one-off payment would be better for you, consider buying us a coffee on Ko-fi. All of our links are in the description. Now, this video will contain spoilers, of course, for the following games: Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Saints Row 4, Call of Duty Ghosts, Spec Ops: The Line, Resident Evil 5, and Metal Gear Solid 5. And finally, before we get stuck in, please be mindful of the following content warnings. This video will contain discussions and depictions of racism, Islamophobia, war and military conflict, blood and gore, and suicide. So, what is neocolonialism anyway? And what does it have to do with my racialized childhood trauma? Let's turn to Kwame Nkrumah, the first Prime Minister of Ghana, for our answer. Nkrumah was a revolutionary socialist leader, instrumental in leading Ghana to formal independence from the British in 1957, and in overseeing this transition in the years that followed. In his 1965 book, Neo-colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, Nkrumah theorized Neocolonialism in the context of Africa. The title is a reference to Russian communist leader Vladimir Lenin's 1917 text, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, in which he wrote, well, what it says on the tin, really. I know I'm not the best at staying on track, but unfortunately we really don't have time here for an in-depth critique of Lenin's takes on imperialism. So just note that these were the writings and ideas that Nkrumah was responding to and building on as a revolutionary socialist. If imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism, as Lenin had argued back in 1917, Nkrumah theorized neocolonialism as a late form of imperialism specific to the post-World War II period. In his words, "The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from the outside. In other words, though the 1960s is often referred to as a period of decolonization, this is a false characterization. Yes, many colonized countries during this period did struggle for their independence by taking up arms, for example, the Algerian Revolution for independence from France. Meanwhile, some imperial powers, frightened and losing their grip on power, decided to, very generously, grant their colonies formal independence, like Belgium did to the Congo. However, in both cases, these countries were so ravaged by decades or centuries of colonialism that they actually had to rely on their former colonizers, or on other imperial powers, to exist as nominally independent states. Algeria and the Congo, then, still relied heavily on France and Belgium, but also on the US, which was emerging in the post-World War II period as the global capitalist superpower. So European and North American imperial powers still retained economic, political, and cultural control over their former colonies, and the US expanded its political control across the global south because it was just that damn rich. A key feature which distinguishes this new colonialism from the old is that it can't openly refer to itself as colonial or imperial anymore, as that's just not woke.
Your fruit-killing skills are remarkable.
So its power is usually maintained through more indirect means, and its propaganda is a bit different. At its core, though, it's just imperialism in a new, or neo, form. To take an example, US and British dominance of global financial markets means that they control market prices, while many formerly colonized countries are in millions of dollars of debt to their former colonizers because they had to take out loans to even attempt to repair the damage done by hundreds of years of systematic underdevelopment and exploitation. This kind of economic control has been in the works for centuries. The link between imperialism and capitalism is not new. The British South Africa Company and the East India Company demonstrate that old colonialism relied on establishing production chains which exploited and stole cheap labor and natural resources from its colonized territories. Under neocolonialism, this has become the primary mode of control, and the process has intensified through new transportation and industrial technologies, but it can no longer flaunt itself proudly. As we discussed a bit in our video on settler colonialism, preying upon existing social divisions or creating new ones, using divide and conquer tactics basically, and weaponizing parts of the local population against itself, is an old trick of colonialism, one which neocolonialism absolutely takes advantage of. Some politicians in global south countries are funded by Western powers and act in their interest, establishing political as well as economic control by the West in these countries. Often the CIA has interfered by clandestinely assassinating leaders that don't support the US. And when political control is threatened by those fighting neocolonialism, neocolonial control sometimes comes to be exercised through the presence of imperial militias, military bases, and so on. Even the latter is not seen as direct control, but is justified through racist and white saviorist logics.
Freedom itself is under attack. Americans are asking, who attacked our country? There are thousands of these terrorists in more than 60 countries. They are sent back to their homes or sent to hide in countries around the world to plot evil. It is not only repressing its own people, it is threatening people everywhere.
Cultural and religious colonialism also persist through the continued dominance of languages like English, French, and Spanish, and through the presence of churches and missions. But under the new colonialism, this has rapidly increased its reach through the onset of new communications technologies. Colonial languages, news, television, film, music, radio, These are broadcast in every corner of the world.
In its own way, radio has made more of an impact and more quickly on Africa than on any other continent. It has brought to the remotest villages, where other media scarcely scratch the surface, communication, information, education, and a release from the isolation that for centuries made Africa the dark continent.
If the sun never set on the British Empire, these days it never sets on Hollywood. Kwame Nkrumah wrote from direct experience of his own context in Ghana in the 1960s, but this model is applicable across the global south, and though it has developed since the 60s, neocolonialism is still alive and doing better than ever. In a nutshell, neocolonialism continues the exploitation of the global south's resources, both in terms of land and life. The development of the global north countries is at their expense. In our deep dive into Life is Strange True Colors, we talked about how this plays out in terms of reproductive labor or gendered labor, which creates global care chains. Neocolonialism is sort of the masculine version of that, which is why it's no coincidence that we'll be talking so much about military games in this video. God, I played so many hours of military games for this. Speaking of which, under old imperialism, powers scrambled over territory and engaged directly in wars with one another, which eventually culminated in the First and Second World Wars. Neocolonialism has only changed the nature of wars which are fought to gain or maintain colonial control. Rather than risking conflict which threatens their own infrastructure,
Who attacked our country?
wars are displaced into the global south. Imperial powers invest instead in proxy wars, where the two parties in conflict are indirectly acting on behalf of the imperial powers. For example, the Angolan Civil War, which is depicted in Metal Gear Solid 5, so we'll come back to it later, was a proxy war. In Angola from 1975 to 2002, when the country became formally independent from Portugal, a power struggle ensued between the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or the MPLA, and the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA. The communist MPLA was backed by Cuba, Brazil, and the USSR, meanwhile the anti-communist UNITA was backed by the US and South Africa. Thus the conflict became a proxy war between the two global superpowers. Another use of divide and conquer, which Nkrumah saw precisely as one of the aims of neocolonialism. Proxy wars help imperial powers gain control of the land for economic exploitation, of course, but they also prevent larger units of solidarity from forming. Nkrumah was an advocate for Pan-Africanism and believed that only a united Africa could resist neocolonial power. Nkrumah also describes how aid from imperial states to neocolonial states is not really about helping people. It's about cementing the imperial state's power.
We will support a process of democratizing.
Your throat-killing skills are remarkable.
Financial aid to a neocolonial state is merely a revolving credit, paid by the neocolonial master, passing through the neocolonial state and returning to the neocolonial master in the form of increased profits. Meanwhile, military aid helps to sustain proxy wars, entrench divisions, and thereby entrench neocolonial power. And humanitarian aid does little to solve the entrenched structural and systemic issues. In summary, in Nkrumah's own words again, the change in the economic relationship between the new sovereign states and the erstwhile masters is only one of form. Colonialism has achieved a new guise. It has become neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Its final bid for existence as monopoly capitalism or imperialism is the last stage of capitalism. Or at least we can hope. In our video on justice in games, we defined the term military-industrial complex. This refers to how a country's military, industry, and political system are connected, forming a single network of power. Big business profits from military exploits, and businesses and the military lobby for public policy which increases military spending, often through direct connections to politicians, many of whom are businessmen themselves. You get the picture. In his book, Nkrumah illustrates that a handful of the same individuals and institutions retain control over global finance, therefore global politics, by sticking their apparently endless fingers into equally endless pies. In Germany, at the time of writing his book, for example, 6 of the biggest banks were represented by their directors on some 750 companies across industry, and 51 of the biggest industrialists sat on the boards of these 6 banks. These links form a chain which creates global domination through finance. The influence exercised by this domination is carried into politics and international affairs, so that the interests of the overriding monopoly groups govern national policies. Their representatives are placed in key positions in national institutions. It isn't hard to think of modern examples like Jeff Bezos and Amazon, or Elon Musk, who now owns the Bird site, whose generational wealth is literally linked to diamond mining in South Africa. Nkrumah more or less describes the US as the most powerful neocolonial power, due to its emergence in the post-World War II period as the biggest economic and political giant around. Similarly, in their book Games of Empire, though they talk about a global empire in a more general sense to demonstrate how it isn't necessarily connected to one specific country, Greg DePuter and Nick Dyer-Witherford tell us that the US is still foremost among its fellow European, Global North, or Western imperial fellows. Nkrumah calls this the collective imperialism of America and Europe. The US military-industrial complex clearly has a vested interest in neocolonialism, and for many reasons. The military upholds it through more obvious means. Just look at the widespread presence of American embassies and military bases across the Middle East, South America, and Africa. Industry, meanwhile, clearly profits from the exploitation of raw materials and cheap labor from the Global South countries, and political and military control of these countries enables more exploitation and more profit. And it's a vicious cycle because these raw materials often facilitate the development of arms and military technology, to perpetuate military control, to keep exploiting raw materials, ad infinitum. An important part of the maintenance of this system is cultural. Businesses will invest in military propaganda in order to sway public opinion towards proxy wars and to normalize American supremacy. And in America, 90% of the media is owned by 6 companies. So, it's not hard. It isn't just about news, though, it's about culture, film, television, and of course video games. This forms part of what Tim Lenoir and Luke Caldwell call the military entertainment complex. Johan Hoagland summarizes the military entertainment complex as essentially the merger between the military-industrial complex and the entertainment industry, a merger that has spawned Hollywood films, television series, and most recently, the computer games. An easy example is the amount of military funding that goes into franchises like Transformers or Avengers, which more or less operate as military propaganda movies. It's basic symbiosis. The military seeks to recruit soldiers and the entertainment industry seeks to create profit, and so ideology and material reality keep one another afloat. Thinking back to the origins of games, even the education sector has a stake. They also seek funding for research while the military seeks technology for its wars. But I'm not about to coin a new term or add yet another hyphen to an existing term, like the rolls off the tongue military industrial media entertainment network. Alright, for Game Assist standards, it hasn't taken too long to finally bring up video games. So once again, it's time to ask, what in the world does political theory have to do with games anyway? Again, we talked about this a bit in our video on settler colonialism, but the production of gaming technology is deeply linked to the production of military technology. This has been the case pretty much since the inception of games, actually. In 1958, William Higginbotham made a tennis game. In 1961, Steve Russell created the game Space War. And in 1966, Ralph Baer devised the first TV-connected game console. These 3 young white men of a certain income bracket developed these technologies while working in university research centers, working to prepare for nuclear war with the Soviets on projects funded by the US Department of Defense, as well as information and telecommunications companies. As early as the 1980s, the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, started adopting or adapting civilian games for training purposes and collaborated with studios to create customized war games. Doubling up for propaganda and practical application, Doom 2 was a commercial game that was modified into the military training simulator Marine Doom, and Full Spectrum Warrior was a military training simulator that was adapted into a commercial game. Particularly after 9/11, the US military poured funds into this, and game developers were eager to capitalize on media coverage of the war on terror and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. Nowadays, most young army recruits have grown up with video games, and partnerships between military and government agencies with tech companies like Microsoft has also led to the creation of drone technology that intentionally uses Xbox and PlayStation-based hardware, with this exact gamer-to-soldier recruitment pipeline in mind. So, gamers are destroying the world, I guess. At the very least, we're helping the war economy boom. But don't worry, I still think there's a chance we can turn this around. Bragging some 19 installments since 2003, while its first releases were focused on World War II, it's no coincidence that Call of Duty was born in the immediate wake of the War on Terror. Back in 2001, not long after my own family immigrated to the global north, the US and Britain responded swiftly to the 9/11 attacks with an invasion of Afghanistan. 2 years later, an invasion of Iraq would follow. Supposedly, the idea was to seek justice, or more specifically vengeance, for 9/11.
Your objectives are clear. Your goal is just.
Though some excuses about saving Afghan and Iraqi civilians from their own oppressive governments were thrown in there for good measure.
It is not only repressing its own people, it is threatening people everywhere.
Well, police, get down on the ground!
Oh, and these countries supposedly contained weapons of mass destruction, too. In reality, there were no weapons of mass destruction to be found, and there was no peace to be wrought. The US and its friends just wanted control over an oil-rich region. They were, in other words, doing a neocolonialism. They'd been doing a neocolonialism for a while, actually. In Afghanistan, the US has been sticking its nose in since the 1950s, at least. The Soviets had been sticking their nose in too. In 1978, Prime Minister Mohammad Daoud Khan was overthrown and a Marxist-Leninist government established the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. This government pursued socialist economic planning and improved the provision of education, healthcare, and other services, but not for everyone. The regime was extremely repressive, with a tendency to violently and/or secretly disappear its opponents. The US started to funnel money and arms towards the resistance, collectively known as the Mujahideen. But the Mujahideen weren't a unified group. They were disparate, especially ideologically. The more organized factions were the Islamic fundamentalist and moderate Islamic Republican ones, but the rebels also included leftists disillusioned by the repressive practices of the government, and folks who wouldn't necessarily define themselves ideologically, but fundamentally opposed the government's repressive practices. US funding and arms, though, went to the more organized groups. All the better for America, which saw communism as a bigger threat at that time than Islamic fundamentalism. The US even brought in ideologically aligned fighters from Egypt, Yemen, and Syria to bolster the resistance. In the 90s, when the Soviet-Afghan War ended and both the USSR and the US withdrew, a power vacuum was created and Afghanistan fell into civil war. The Islamic fundamentalists who had received American funds and arms went on to form Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The Taliban went to form the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan in '96, but when the US invaded in 2001, this quickly collapsed, and of course it would. The US is the biggest military force in the world, and the Taliban barely had an air force. They pursued peace pretty early on, actually, even offering to hand bin Laden over to the Americans as early as October 2001 in order to end the US bombing campaign that was ravaging the country. But the Bush administration declined the offer. Shocking if the reason behind invading Afghanistan was simply to topple the Taliban government. But clearly it wasn't. The aim had never just been to get bin Laden, but to establish a pro-American government and American military bases in the oil-rich region. The public rationale to stay shifted. It was now a long-term project to root out so-called terror.
There are thousands of these terrorists in more than 60 countries. They are sent back to their homes or sent to hide in countries around the world, to plot evil.
And to build Afghanistan up, to offer aid. We know what Nkrumah had to say about American aid, anyway. In 2003, they invaded Iraq as part of this long-term project, the War on Terror, as the president called it. The millions of people who marched against the war knew the rationale was a lie, that peaceful options hadn't been exhausted, that the UK and US had undermined the UN and engaged in an illegal war, and most damningly, that intelligence regarding the presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which played a massive part in justifying the war, was completely circumstantial. The UK-Iraq inquiry showed that the Bush administration had in fact been intent on invading since the late 1990s, long before 9/11. In fact, the US and UK had once been friendly with now public enemy number one, the president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein. After World War I, control of the oil-rich Iraq was transferred from the declining Ottoman Empire to the still-kicking British Empire. The Iraqi monarchy was closely allied with the British, but discontent increasingly grew. Anti-British sentiment was not only popular in Iraq, but across the Middle East, which had been divided up between European colonizers after the war. It was at this time that the idea of Arab nationalism, or Pan-Arabism, gained traction, similar to Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism. Many believed that only a united Arab world could resist European imperialism, which sought to divide and conquer with the arbitrary state lines it drew. Arab nationalism had ideologically disparate components, though, those further to the left and those further to the right. As the British Empire began to collapse, neo-colonial control of the region took shape. There were many power struggles with British and CIA involvement, culminating in the overthrow of General Abdul Karim Qasim in 1963, via a CIA-backed coup which brought the Pan-Arab Ba'ath Party to power. Though Pan-Arabism is, of course, anti-imperialist and Ba'ath had socialist roots, the party moved further to the right, especially under Saddam Hussein, hence the CIA's strategic support. In 1979, when the Iranian Revolution displaced the Western-backed Shah to form the Islamic Republic of Iran, the US administration found it particularly handy to fund Hussein, who they backed during the Iran-Iraq War. Years later, they would pretend they never had, charging him with war crimes for the use and development of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons for use against Iran. But this wouldn't have been possible without material support from the US. During the Cold War, this strategy of indirect conflict and proxy war was useful, as the two great powers struggled for dominance. But with the decline of the Soviet Union, America began to gain monopolistic control over the Middle East. One of the major motivations for backing of Iraq, that is, mitigating the influence of the USSR in the region, vanished. When Hussein's regime invaded Kuwait in 1990, he thought the US would at least stay out of it, but he was wrong. US ties with the Gulf monarchies took precedent. Thus began the First Gulf War, and when it ended, the US imposed economic sanctions on Iraq. At this point, US policy proceeded to take a sharp militaristic turn, without the Soviet Union to deter it in the Middle East. They didn't invade Iraq right away as the timing wasn't right. The USSR was only just in its death throes, and their monopolistic control over the Arab world was only beginning to form. But when the turn of the century came, it would provide the perfect opportunity to overthrow Hussein's regime and to subjugate Iraq once and for all. An era of increasing US militarization, the onset of the War on Terror, and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were prime pickings for games developers to exploit for entertainment. Call of Duty was created in this context, romanticizing a bygone era with its popular World War II games from 2003 onward. But in 2007, it began to work with the US military to depict realistic modern warfare. Each Call of Duty game has a campaign mode with a linear story. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare, there are two main playable protagonists: Sergeant John McTavish, bizarrely nicknamed Soap, a British SAS or Special Air Service recruit, and US Marine Corps Sergeant Paul Jackson. In a few missions, you briefly play as other characters. For one particularly notable mission, you are an anonymous gunship operator on a realistically depicted Lockheed A-130 gunship, and in another, unable to do anything but turn your head, you are placed in the perspective of the president of unnamed Middle Eastern country, Yasser al-Fulani, before he is executed. The game follows a civil war in Russia between its government and a group vaguely designated as the ultra-nationalists, led by the fictional Imran Zakhaev. Meanwhile, the US invades unnamed Middle Eastern country after the anti-Western Khalid al-Assad leads a coup which results in a civil war. As it turns out, Zakhaev and al-Assad are allied, as the SAS first begin to unravel when they find a nuclear device aboard a Russian ship labeled in the the devil's language, Arabic. When the US Marines infiltrate al-Assad's home, a nuclear device detonates the whole city, but swiftly moving on, the SAS finds al-Assad in Azerbaijan, tortures him for information, and murders him, which is when they find out that he was allied with the Russians. And not just any Russians, as it turns out. Zakhaev profited from nuclear proliferation after the collapse of the USSR and lured ex-Soviet soldiers to form his ultranationalist party. Things escalate pretty quickly after that, with the SAS and USMC trying to capture Zakhaev's son for information, said son taking his own life before that can happen, Zakhaev taking control of a nuclear launch facility and launching some missiles, as you do. Somehow, nuclear apocalypse is prevented by our Western heroes, and Soap kills Zakhaev in a final dramatic mano-a-mano. Considering the premise alone, we see how it mimics real-world events, but obscures them and frames them from a neo-colonial perspective. Allyship between Russia and unnamed Arab country mimics the dynamics of the Cold War period, when many Arab nationalist governments allied themselves with the USSR to oppose Western imperialism, and it invokes the anti-communist fear of Russia as a superpower to rival the US, particularly considering that the ultranationalists are formed of ex-Soviets. The use of nuclear weapons feeds into the false narrative which justified the invasion of Iraq, and little insight is given into the conflict in unnamed Middle Eastern country, but revolutionary leader al-Assad is emphatically an anti-Western figure, while the player is, for a moment, placed in the first-person perspective of presumably Western-backed President al-Fulani, to emphasize his perspective as aligned with the implied white American player. Simultaneously in this scene, al-Fulani is rendered powerless, a mere pawn in the imperialist game. The meanings are complex. The player's perspective both is and is not his. We are him and the Western imperialism which controls him. The scene is not interactive though, so we are also unable to control him, reflecting his own lack of control but perhaps ours too. He is both controlled and uncontrollable, the very contradiction at the heart of the way imperialism imagines its racialized subjects. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare, there are NPCs that, while poorly developed, offer clear points of identification for the player. They are, quite simply, the only ones that have any discernible humanizing characteristics, recognizable names, faces, and voices. Most of these NPCs are your fellow British or American officers, serving alongside the player characters. Some of these even serve on missions with Soap after Jackson's death, creating a consistent player perspective in which these characters are aligned, the collective imperialism of Britain and the US. Some exceptions, interestingly, include Russian loyalists and informants who aid the British SAS and the US Marines. Now, I haven't played the Modern Warfare reboots because I simply wasn't willing to give that much time or money to this endeavour, but I am aware that in an interesting turn of events, Soap becomes a somewhat more discernible character. Discernible enough, apparently, to have homoerotic tension with his bros. Not that I have time to discuss the politics of masculinity and homoeroticism in war games. Turn to Daz's video on Overwatch for a taste of that if you fancy it. But considering that these reboots also introduce Farah Karim, an apparently Arab woman from the fictional Central Asian country of Uzbekistan, let's just forget distinctions between language, culture, and history then, as well as the controversy over the introduction of a non-binary character option in Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, it seems that our favourite military propaganda machine is now invested in the politics of inclusion and progressivism. Fan-fucking-tastic. The techniques which COD and games of its ilk employ as propaganda are satirized in the opening of Volition's Saints Row 4. The series is famous for its rich, playful, metatextual sequences, and Saints Row 4 is no different, immediately drawing attention to its own constructedness as a narrative. Eden Regal's off-kilter British accent provides the voice of our third-person narrator, riffing off the first page of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that every now and again a situation arises that defies explanation.
Before she later reveals herself to actually be Jane Austen. After Jane's lovely introduction, we begin the mission Zero Saints 30, a reference to the 2012 blockbuster Zero Dark 30, a crowning achievement of the military entertainment complex. The poorly lit thriller is about girl boss Maya Harris and her quest to assassinate her very own white whale, none other than Al-Qaeda leader himself, Osama bin Laden. The film makes some effort to problematize the CIA's use of torture and the protagonist's alienation from her own humanity, and from humanity in general, which is required in order to fulfill her mission, but her sacrifice is ultimately deemed worthy, in service of the supposed need to protect American security from foreign threats. You know, foreign threats which barely compare to them in military might. The irreverent Zero Saints 30, by contrast, lays American imperialist propaganda bare in a few deft audiovisual strokes. The mission opens with the image of a helicopter flying over a group of oil rigs, revealing the true neo-colonial motivations of romanticized US military operations like this one, to obtain imperialist control over oil-rich regions. The American Saints are working with former MI6 agents, demonstrating the collective imperialism of Britain and the US, which of course mimics the allyship between the US and Britain showed in Modern Warfare and essential to the War on Terror. We're the good guys, of course. As far as the enemy is concerned, Saints Row 4 refuses to specify any leaders, individuals, countries, or political groups. Why bother? The mission objectives simply read execute terrorist or kill terrorists. That's all we need to know. In Zero Saints 30, the player character is faceless and nameless, wearing a helmet and unable to turn on their mic. It makes me think of Soap and Jackson, whose voices we never hear and whose faces we never see. They represent the perspective of Western imperialism, but they have no individuality to speak of. They're interchangeable, replaceable, pawns in a winning game. Just following orders. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As I mentioned earlier, this is complicated by the fact that flirty gay voice lines and the inclusion of racialized women appear to indicate a shift, a new investment in characterizing playable protagonists a little more distinctly in the reboot of Modern Warfare. I think we can mostly thank the modern age of corporate and statal virtue signaling for that. The new era of COD sees Infinity Ward, like many corporations and institutions, walking the delicate tightrope between upholding a military entertainment complex, which at its core relies on the dehumanization of racialized people and other marginalized groups, and capitalizing on depicting the minorities doing the war crimes. So progressive! The white gays, as always, seem to be lapping it up. Boyfriends who slay together, stay together. Good and bad are simple. Friendlies are green and enemies are red. It's a shorthand used for gameplay purposes, but it immediately inscribes morality and value onto bodies and onto lives. It's okay to kill the bad guys, they deserve it. But who are the green guys, and who are the red guys? The enemy NPCs in Zero Saints 30 are similar to those in unnamed Middle Eastern country back in COD Modern Warfare. They're always men, because women and children are too innocent to feel good about killing. These men consistently wear keffiyeh, a headdress with deep historical, cultural, and political meaning. It's a cloth often worn by Arab and North African men, usually workers, to protect them from sunburn, dust, and sand. Traditionally worn by Palestinian farmers while available in different colors, the black and white keffiyeh became popularized as a symbol of pan-Arab and Palestinian resistance against imperialism in the 20th century. It's often worn by non-Palestinians to demonstrate their solidarity with the struggle. Speaking of which, if you do fancy wearing your support for Palestinians loud and proud, do consider supporting Palestine with your purchase by buying from Hirbawi Keffiyeh, the last and only keffiyeh factory in Palestine. But to pivot jarringly back to our discussion of racism and Islamophobia, in these games the keffiyeh is used to racialize enemy NPCs as dangerous revolutionary Arab and Islamic terrorists. In Saints Row 4, keffiyeh are even wrapped around their faces as well as their heads, literally making them faceless. In Saints Row 4, as the NPCs make incoherent sounds, the subtitles read Arabic. The devil's language. Their motives are simplistic, childlike, and without context. Reducible to graffiti of nukes crosses over the American flag, guns shooting at the word capitalist, and the words die infidel. And yet, this encompasses all we need to know to justify killing them. That they hate America, the land of the free. That they hate capitalism, which is freedom.
Freedom itself is under attack.
And that they absolutely, most certainly do have nuclear weapons, and are religious zealots, no doubt Muslim. See, they are a threat to our security. Turns out that these barbaric Arabs are working for an American named Cyrus who intends to use them to achieve his own goals, to nuke Washington and to start all over. This is interesting, because on one hand it places ultimate responsibility for the violence of these so-called terrorists on a hypermasculine American military figure, symbolic of the American state at large. But equally it humanizes this American leader more than it humanizes his lackeys, who are ultimately incapable of leading themselves, as their foreign gibberish and childlike drawings seem to suggest. Of course, this is a white saviorist mentality. This civilizing mission is what justifies American wars. If those barbaric Arabs weren't so backwards, we wouldn't have to step in to solve the problems we absolutely under no circumstances caused in the first place, would we? In Modern Warfare, the invasion of unnamed Middle Eastern country is justified because the US is helping after the execution of a democratically elected leader. We aren't offered any context about what kind of leader al-Fulani is. All we know is that he is certainly Western-backed, otherwise the anti-Western al-Assad wouldn't want him dead. Of course, if what these people want is the US to get the hell out, they can't actually know what they want, right? Because we know what's good for them. In Saints Row 4, the anonymous figure of the Saints boss climbs up the side of a missile to disable it, before landing right in the president's office and unlocking the adoration of America and the presidency, featuring the hilarious but slightly disconcerting feature: press all buttons to initiate global thermonuclear war. In the world of Saints Row 4, the US is run by a gang with a hidden arsenal of weapons in the White House. And that's when the aliens invade. The alien invasion narrative, which is the focus of Saints Row 4 in dialogue with the Zero Saints 30 prologue, becomes a comedic take on the popularization of the destruction and invasion narrative post 9/11. Stacy Takacs argues that these stories contributed to and critiqued the politics of fear restructuring US social relations at the time, as fear is not a timeless and universal experience, but a socially constructed discourse that conditions behavior and belief in certain ways, as implied by the term politics of fear. The two major components of what historian Peter Stearns calls the American way of fear are fear of racial others and a tendency towards apocalypticism, which are both, of course, at play in the alien invasion genre and are deeply symbolic of post-9/11 fears. In Saints Row 4, you are armed with everything from standard AKs to ridiculous stars and stripes clad weapons, but only alien invaders overpower the most immense military force on Earth. When the aliens subjugate us, they place us in a mental prison which represents the player character's biggest fear, a 1950s sitcom-style life of domesticity. Saints Row 4 satirizes the militaristic hypermasculine power fantasies at the core of military shooters and many other AAA games, but in the end, of course, there is no limit to your power. We may not always be so sure if we're the good guys anymore, but what we do know is that we'll always win. Of course, the thing about the post-9/11 fear of invasion is that the image of the invader as an enormous force with world-destroying power is simply false. Those nukes were never found, and the Taliban didn't even have an air force. If anyone is an alien invader with world-destroying power, well, it's America. Call of Duty Ghosts is an interesting outlier in the COD series in that sense. There isn't even an attempt to resemble historical reality here, as the story is set in a near future in which the Middle East has been destroyed by nuclear warfare and a group of oil-producing South American countries have united to form the Federation of the Americas. The Federation quickly grows into a global superpower, filling the power vacuum left by the US, presumably because its control over Middle Eastern oil vanished overnight, and invade the US. The central fear that drives Call of Duty Ghosts is that of Global South nations exploited by US imperialism, uniting and resisting, and turning this power back against the US. The fear of the oppressed rising against their oppressors, first and foremost, then the fear of experiencing oppression, of displacement, invasion, disenfranchisement. But of course, we're still the good guys. We're always the good guys. Emanuel Mayberg argues that Ghosts takes a Call of Duty player, creates a fiction around him where America is put in the position of many of the countries we fight today, weaker than us, defeated from the sky, and allows him to become what we fear. Given the right conditions, maybe he'll suddenly find himself empathizing with the enemy whose point of view we rarely consider. In a nutshell, in Ghosts we occupy the position of the Mujahideen, later the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, always resisting an imperialist power, lacking the military might of our opponents, and resorting to a fervent determination to take drastic action, to resist by any means necessary. But I don't know if COD wants us to empathize with that point of view. I don't know if the implied player of a COD game necessarily understands America as a global superpower encroaching on others. Not to discredit the critical reading skills of gamers, but to remember that Infinity Ward and COD are part of the military entertainment complex, working closely and symbiotically with the military to create military propaganda and recruitment tools. In fact, at its core, the fear which drives Ghosts is the same fear which drives the other games. The only difference is that in Ghosts this fear has been realized, but even then it hasn't totally been realized. I don't believe you ever really meaningfully experience powerlessness in Ghosts. We are still American. We still get our heroic action sequences, our tanks, our gunships, you name it. Things our real-life Islamic fundamentalist counterparts, once again, do not have. Infinity Ward is obsessed with realism. From Call of Duty's hyper-realistic visuals to its pride about working with military consultants to bring you a realistic experience of modern warfare. But games like Saints Row 4 encourage us to ask, how realistic is COD, really? What is realism anyway, and what does it achieve as a narrative and political tool? As Adrienne Shaw argues in her exploration of Assassin's Creed 3, which we discussed in depth in our video on settler colonialism, the tyranny of realism is that games focus too much on questions of accuracy rather than emancipatory possibility. She points out that while claims of realism can always be challenged, what is ultimately more important, politically speaking, is to examine how histories are told. History is, after all, a question of narrative. How are these narratives constructed? Whose narratives are included and whose are excluded? Dean Chan argues further that game developers' quest for historical authenticity and graphical realism are collusive in recirculating dominant constructions of racial otherness. Simply put, that developers of war games are using claims of realism to justify racist coding in their games. Never mind the historical inaccuracies or points of obvious narrative constructedness that could be pulled from all of these games. Even military practitioners themselves have pointed out the obvious point that real warfare doesn't include dramatic music or action sequences, that the colorful visual cues for enemies and friendlies aren't present. In the end, says Chan, these predeterminations belie the utterly constructed nature of the game worlds presented in these war games, as well as the ideological dimensions of realist narratives. Call of Duty provides a fine example. Claims of realism can, of course, be questioned when it comes to Call of Duty. I've already offered up an analysis of the ways that modern warfare obscures historical context. Matthew Gault points out that 2019's Modern Warfare reboot also obscures events from the First Gulf War, using images of a highway bombed by the US in 1991 to inspire a highway in the fictional country of Uzbekistan. In his words, "We're told in a cutscene that during its invasion of this fictional country, Russia bombed the highway, killing people trying to escape. Just like that, in a piece of popular fiction, American atrocities become Russian atrocities. It's the kind of distance players need to separate themselves from history, to watch the road uncritically through a scope, and place bullets downrange so that their enemies' heads satisfyingly explode." When it comes to rewriting history, the interest is not in emancipatory possibility, but in reinforcing hegemony. For those games which do leverage claims of realism, like 6 Days in Fallujah, announced in 2009 to uproar and cancelled only to have resurfaced recently to more uproar, claims to realism and sensitivity aim to present the game's perspective as an objective truth. In reality, it's just that, a perspective. When developer Highwire is Seattle-based, when the game's website brags its first-personal tactical military shooter perspective in which you lead a fire team through battle, it seems pretty clear that 6 Days will reinforce the hegemonic US imperialist perspective offered in most FPS shooters, but in a way that is so historically specific, unlike COD, as to be further re-traumatizing and emotionally exploitative. Rightly, 6 Days has been critiqued, particularly by Iraqis themselves, raising the question of who the game will actually ask players to empathize with. Claims of realism are used to elide these questions, presenting hegemonic perspective as objective truth. Johan Hogland, using America's Army, Kuma War, Close Combat First to Fight, and Full Spectrum Warrior as case studies, also interrogates this, differentiating between realistic and real. He argues that to say a game is realistic merely means that the game appears lifelike, but these games are also marketed as being real in the sense that they tell stories or allow the gamer to take part in actions that are or could be true. This claim is made partly because all 4 games have been developed in close cooperation with military personnel, and partly because they deal precisely with military violence in the Middle East, something the American, as well as global citizen, encounters routinely through CNN and other American broadcast news providers. But, of course, this is not real, this is a perspective. It is important to keep in mind that when these games claim to be real, this claim has more to do with the historical and ideological content than with the game's capacity to render a lifelike version of the Middle East. Returning to COD, it would seem that Infinity Ward is less interested in historical realism than in military realism. They want to simulate the realities of modern combat, at least in terms of what guns and weapons are used, what kinds of strategies are employed, and so on. Of course, even this can be questioned thanks to the dramatic action sequences and the over-the-top nuclear apocalypse scenarios, but ultimately it doesn't matter. These games are ideologically consistent with the histories, the stories, the fears that are instilled in us by Western politicians. Military realism, on the other hand, maximizes funding and partnerships with military and corporate bodies, with an interest in using games to create military propaganda. More than that, game hardware and software is increasingly a part of the reality of warfare, so much so that creating these entertaining, heroic power fantasy games is conditioning future generations of drone strikers, tank drivers, and gunship operators. While realism can be used to elide critique of ideology in this way, fiction can be used in the same way. It's just escapism, right? But who writes fiction? Human beings, of course, who have internalized certain social, cultural, and political norms. Human beings who have heard Bush's speeches on television, who have watched fetishizing racist newsreels over and over. When it comes to the genre of military shooters, both fiction and realism are, in different ways, doing a neocolonialism. Now, of course, not all mainstream shooters or military games are blatant neo-colonial propaganda. Even some of the games I talked about contain points of tension, like the anonymity of the player character in Modern Warfare. But there are some AAA games which make a point of critiquing the military entertainment complex, US imperialism and neocolonialism. What do these critiques have to say, though, and how do they say it? Who is making these games, and why? An immediately obvious example to those who have played it or are aware of its reputation is Spec Ops: The Line. The Line wasn't a commercial success when it was released in 2012, but it has since become something of a cult classic. Developed by the German studio Jaeger, Spec Ops: The Line is the 10th installment intended as a reboot or revival of the Spec Ops series, which began in 1998 with Spec Ops: Rangers Lead the Way. Jaeger hadn't developed any of the previous games, which came from the British and American Zombie, Runecraft, and Big Grub Studios. Zombie Studios in particular, who innovated the series before Runecraft and Big Grub came on board, also worked on various FPS and military games including Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, World War II Combat, and Shadow Ops. Now, I'm about to spoil a game with a lot of twists and turns in it, so if you want to experience it yourself first, I really recommend pausing, giving it a spin, and then coming back to watch the rest of this video. At first, Spec Ops: The Line has the basic narrative structure and gameplay of any FPS shooter campaign. Interestingly, The Line is a third-person, not a first-person shooter. That anonymization of the military protagonist which occurs in COD is notably missing here even from early in the game. The player character is Captain Martin Walker, the leader of an elite Delta team comprising himself and his comrades, Lieutenant Adams and Sergeant Lugo. In an alternative reality or near future, the dead city of Dubai has become buried by sand, and Delta Team is sent in to investigate a distress signal looking for Colonel John Conrad and his unit, the 33rd. Conrad was sent in when the devastating sandstorms first hit Dubai to evacuate civilians. Walker used to serve with Conrad in Kabul in Afghanistan, and describes the man as a hero who immediately took his troops out of Afghanistan to go help in Dubai. Delta Team comes into contact with a group of Emirati insurgents led by a CIA agent, learning that they're in conflict with the 33rd, which has gone rogue. Halfway through the game, Walker employs a white phosphorus attack to obliterate Delta Team's opposition and advance further into the city, but realizes that he's killed a number of civilians in the process. Walker blames Conrad and the 33rd moves on. Here, things start getting dark and increasingly surreal. Conrad starts to communicate with Walker via radio, questioning the morality of his actions. Walker works with another CIA agent, Riggs, to damage the 33rd's operations, but Riggs destroys the water supply, leaving the surviving citizens of Dubai to die of dehydration in order to cover up the atrocities committed by the 33rd. Lugo is lynched by Emirati civilians, Adams is killed in combat, and Walker finally makes it to Conrad's penthouse. Conrad at first appears as a textbook villain, but is quickly revealed to be a rotting corpse. Walker realizes that Conrad took his own life after failing the evacuation attempt and that he's been distorting events in his mind in order to cope with the guilt and shame of his actions. In this final confrontation with Conrad in his penthouse and in Walker's mind palace, the player must decide whether they/Walker should shoot themselves or shoot Conrad, implicitly either accepting responsibility for their/his actions or continuing to blame it on Conrad. In one of 4 endings, Walker shoots himself. If you shoot Conrad, there are 3 potential outcomes. A US Army unit will arrive to pick Walker up, and you can drop your weapon and go home with them, or shoot him up. If you kill them all successfully, the cycle of violence continues. If you are killed, he lays on the ground bleeding. In his last moments, he reminisces about his time in Afghanistan with Conrad, who told him,
Home? We can't go home. There is a line men like us have to cross. If we're lucky, we do what's necessary and then we die. No, all I really want, Captain, is peace.
The line is polarizing. One of the biggest sources of contention amongst critics has been whether the game's adherence to genre conventions of military shooter gameplay was an effective or a restrictive choice. Personally, I think that subverting genre conventions can be a powerful tool in conveying specific messages, in specific contexts, to a specific audience. So, who is this audience? In The Positive Discomfort of Spec Ops: The Line, Christine Jorgensen examines how players who did like the line reported positive discomfort in their experience of the game. Her interviewees consistently said that their emotional response was rooted in the fact that the game created a sense of safety and familiarity for them by using genre conventions, then, by subverting them, created a discomfort which was ultimately positive because it invoked self-reflection. In fact, it didn't only encourage self-reflection, it also encouraged questioning their culturally received and most fundamental values. This begins to answer our question. For these interviewees, the military shooter genre conventions created a sense of safety and familiarity. Jorgensen's interviewees were exclusively white Nordic people, mainly men. Similarly, the body of games journalism on the line, compiled at Critical Distance, reflects the white male perspective that dominates this debate. Many of the white male, occasionally female players that Jorgensen interviewed talked about how the line ordered them to take exactly the same actions they would in a COD game, but made the violent consequences of those actions visible to them. Of course, a white Western audience is one to whom this violence was invisible in the first place, an audience with no experience of such violence. If the spectacle of violence, particularly the spectacle of racialized violence, is used to subvert expectations and create emotional responses, then racialized bodies become props. This game aims to invoke discomfort in people who have never questioned the violence of war invisibilized in war games, but in doing so it reinforces the white subject position and the racialized object position. It excludes an audience to whom this violence was already visible, racialized people living in regions afflicted by neocolonialism or living in diaspora with family back home. As you might remember from the childhood anecdote that I opened with, military shooters have always made me uncomfortable, so in that regard the line was no exception. It was just a bit more self-aware. Jorgensen found that the participants in her study stressed that the realist framing of Spec Ops: The Line is important for the experience. While traditional military-themed games have been criticized for representing warfare in a sanitized or glorified way, Spec Ops: The Line goes against this trend. Traditional shooters are frequently described in terms of realism or authenticity, but for the respondents of this study, neither photorealism nor an authentic simulation of warfare is in focus. Instead, they are more interested in how the game stresses the impact that war has on soldiers and civilians, and the psychological reactions of the soldiers in the game narrative are believable. In this sense, the realism that they stress is a social kind of realism that highlights a believable setting and narrative. Earlier, I critiqued COD's obsession with photorealism and military realism, But what do we make of the line's emphasis on social realism? As I've already begun to allude to, it arguably reinforces a similar perspective, but a merely somewhat self-critical one. Brendan Kao, in his start-to-finish critical reading of the line, argues that it's a shooter about shooters, a game which turns its focus outwards to not ask questions about shooters as they are designed, but as they are consumed. Consumed, as I've said, by white people, though Kao, like other critics, has a tendency to universalize the player rather than to consider how the implied player of the line is constructed, or how different player demographics might respond to the game. Kao contends further that the game refuses to answer questions, that it simply wants to expose complex dualities. It refuses to moralize to us, it refuses to say that shooters are good or bad, and it does not attempt to offer an alternative to the shooter, nor does it suggest that we even need an alternative. He concludes, "It's not that I will stop playing shooters, but I will no longer be able to deny what I am truly doing in them." I'm not totally sure how I feel about the argument that the line refuses to moralize to the player. Jorgensen's study has this to say. In Spec Ops The Line, if the player wants to see the conclusion of the narrative, he must play, and through playing, he becomes complicit in the events that take place in the game. Here, the sudden sense of complicity creates the dramatic effect of negative emotions, the dramatic turning point and the sudden realization that the player is complicit. This is what creates the emotional shift, and the game is indeed trying to replicate or simulate the sense of reversal, even though it may be questionable whether the narrative turning point of the game creates actual reversal. The sense of complicity allows the player to engage with the game using moral reasoning, and stresses the fact that gameplay actions have a moral dimension. Kao, I think, rightly observes that no one in the game ever really calls you, or Walker as the playable character, a bad person. But Jorgensen points out that in her research she found that the sense of complicity created by the game elicits negative emotions precisely because it encourages the player to use moral reasoning. Nobody's calling you bad, but the game is making you feel complicit in violent acts, then showing you the violent consequences of these acts. Its endings are all pretty doom and gloom too. There's nothing to do but feel bad about doing bad things, with no sense of how you, with regards to the real violence represented and implicated in shooters, or Walker as the player character which represents complicity in this violence, could be accountable for those actions. Feeling responsible is not the same as being accountable. Being accountable is about materially repairing harm and creating new systems which prevent further harm from occurring. The line gives us no such choices. The positive discomfort which Jorgen describes is limited then, in my view. It doesn't challenge us enough, it only encourages us to pat ourselves on the back for simply realizing how much we dehumanize people or representations of people in order to mow them down like so much grass. Wow, job done. Which brings us to the line's refusal to offer alternatives, a reading of the text which I do agree with but do not like. In representing war more realistically, of course from a certain perspective, the line refuses to offer alternatives, just as Adrian Shaw argued regarding Assassin's Creed 3's refusal to show us emancipatory possibility for the sake of realism. Among the 4 endings of the line, 2 result in Walker's death. Kao argues that this is Walker taking responsibility, that Walker shooting himself in the head feels righteous, and that Walker getting shot by US soldiers instead of going home feels like redemption, because at least he can admit not who he had become, but what he always had been. The poor man gets to find peace at last. Absolutely, and I cannot stress this enough, fucking not. I do not accept that. My critique of this reading is summarized really well by one of my favorite TikTokers' breakdown of BoJack Horseman. I know this might seem out of left field, but I promise it's relevant, so just stick with me. So BoJack does shitty things, but he feels like shit the entire time.
Piece of shit. Stupid piece of shit. You're a real stupid piece of shit. But I know I'm a piece of shit. That at least makes me better than all the pieces of shit who don't know they're pieces of shit. Or is it worse?
Lucky Lefty proposes, and I wholeheartedly agree, that it's worse because
acknowledgement is not acceptance, and that acknowledgement is not action. Although Bojack attempts to acknowledge the worst things he does, he interprets acknowledgement as atonement. It's already an insincere act, but it's made so much worse by the fact that whenever Bojack attempts to bring up the ways that he's hurt other people, he centers himself in the narrative. And that's what makes this mindset so much worse than, say, an incredibly selfish person blissfully traipsing around with no awareness of the harm they're perpetuating. Acknowledgement is commonly interpreted as the first step towards genuine improvement, but if that's the only step you're willing to make, it's essentially meaningless.
Bojack and Walker are very different characters, of course, but they are both traumatized, suffering white men. Or, horses that are coded as white men, who are responsible for the trauma and suffering of others, usually oppressed groups like women in Bojack's case and racialized people in Walker's case. Death for both of these men is the ultimate refusal of accountability. They achieve individual peace and never have to do the work that's required to change, to genuinely account for the harm that they've caused. And no, I don't mean that they deserve to be or should be punished. Where Walker is concerned, there are men like him, real veterans suffering as a result of their experiences at war, who have taken genuine accountability for their actions. There are many veterans who have come to understand their role in upholding global white supremacy and imperialism, who now reject these structures and actively fight them. Will Griffin of Veterans for Peace, for example, wrote that he has been on the wrong side of history, and it wasn't until he visited Standing Rock in October 2016 when he actually served the American people, instead of fighting for corporate interests. Now, as for the player, their complicity in white supremacist neo-colonial violence is actually unlikely to mimic Walker's exactly, unless they are a military veteran or plan on joining the military. But we also have a material complicity as players which we need to understand, which the line doesn't meaningfully interrogate except arguably for one instance. Chapter 8, in which you deploy white phosphorus, invokes the very real game-like technology at the core of modern warfare. KO points out that the line challenges shooters as they are consumed, rather than as they are produced, and I contend that this is part of what is so limiting to the line's messages. Of course, we don't directly control the means of production of games, but we do fund military technology simply by purchasing games like COD, or by paying to see Marvel movies in the cinema, or paying for a Disney Plus subscription, etc., etc., etc. Now, I don't think it's politically useful to shame people and hold them individually responsible for these purchases, but at the collective level, people can agitate for changes in production chains via targeted boycotts and other political tactics. Consider how the Boycott South Africa movement, by lobbying companies to take their money out of the apartheid state, brought a formal end to apartheid. What if gamers rose up? What good does it do exactly to compel white players to feel responsible for their virtual actions, to encourage them to acknowledge their responsibility for these actions, and simply leave them with despair? These narrative approaches simply present violence as inevitable, and indeed KO will continue playing his shooters, he'll just feel kinda bad about it now. In the first place, what responsibility is KO acknowledging when he plays shooters from now on? He describes it simply in terms of the player reveling in violence, reveling in the virtual representation for our entertainment of human lives being quashed. The work of the line, in other words, specifically disturbs the way we dehumanize those we are killing in games in order to create an entertaining experience. But what good does it do to acknowledge that we are dehumanizing those we are virtually killing? Do we dehumanize them any less? Do we stop killing them? And is it enough to address this at the level of form and content, of gameplay and narrative and player action, but not at the level of development? While I can't find the original article mentioned, Critical Distance credits Sparky Clarkson with critiquing the line's overemphasis on player responsibility and underemphasis on the role of the developer. I couldn't agree more. It is, after all, not just a matter of violent ideology within the game texts, but the violent chains of production that create these games. Developers are responsible for producing content, for facilitating the gamer-to-soldier pipeline, but they are also responsible for sustaining the military-industrial complex through partnerships and shared resources, not just game and software developers, but hardware developers too. This is not a question of a so-called human nature and its supposedly violent delights. These are man-made things we can change materially. Why not invoke emancipatory possibility at the level of content to inspire emancipatory possibility in the real world? Why not create the kind of game that would not only inspire questions but action? The kind of game that would encourage gamers to protest conventions at Excel, a centre that not only hosts the UK's biggest nerd fests from EGX to MCM to the Pokemon World Championships, but also the world's largest arm fair. The kind of game that would inspire tech workers to go on strike, to refuse companies' complicity in violence. I want to look a little deeper at the question of ideology in the line, actually, because there's a covert racism, a colonial undercurrent at play throughout this game, which I've alluded to. As I've said, the game has a clear, white male target audience in mind, and its developers, clearly, are part of the same demographic. Looking at the texts which the line takes inspiration from cements this further. Joseph Conrad's 1899 novel Heart of Darkness and Francis Ford Coppola's 1979 film Apocalypse Now, which was in turn inspired by Conrad's novel, are clearly referenced in the game with the naming of Colonel Conrad. As others have extensively pointed out, Conrad is a nod to the author of Heart of Darkness, but with the K from the name of his character Kurtz, while the rank Colonel is a nod to the Colonel Kurtz of Coppola's film. This places the line within a Western tradition of ostensibly anti-colonial and anti-war texts with a disturbing undercurrent that reinforces the very ideology at the heart of the war and imperialism they seek to critique. In Heart of Darkness, sailor and narrator Charles Marlowe tells his listeners about an assignment for a Belgian company in an unnamed African country, which is generally accepted by readers to be the Congo at the time it was owned by King Leopold II of Belgium. Marlowe conveys his encounter with Kurtz, an ivory trader and commander who initially goes to Africa on a civilizing mission, racist in the palatable liberal sense, but it quickly becomes blatantly and unacceptably racist as he becomes intent on exterminating all the brutes. He positions himself as a demigod among the native Congolese, becomes ill with fever, and then dies. The geographical descent into the so-called Heart of Darkness, i.e. the Congo, which is filled with dark-skinned barbaric people, emphasizes Kurt's psychological descent into the Heart of Darkness, from civilized white man to barbaric man, as metaphorically black as the people he rules. Ostensibly, Conrad is critiquing the horrors of imperialism, but Nigerian author Chinua Achebe offers a searing critique of the racism which underpins this attempt. Achebe claims that there is a desire, one might indeed say need, in Western psychology to set Africa up as a foil to Europe, a place of negotiations at once remote and vaguely familiar, in comparison with which Europe's own taste of spiritual grace will be manifest. Conrad's book is only one example of this, but Achebe is interested in it precisely because Conrad saw and condemned the evil of imperial exploitation, but was strangely unaware of the racism on which it sharpened its iron tooth. While his narrator is horrified at the atrocities committed by Europeans in the Congo, Africans are consistently described in dehumanizing ways, as masses of limbs and rolling eyes, as savages, and they're almost entirely voiceless throughout the novel. The racist descriptions of the narrator aren't juxtaposed with any alternative ways of seeing Africans either. Achebe points out that while Conrad's exploration of the minds of the European characters is often penetrating and full of insight, ultimately he perpetuates the dehumanization of Africans by using Africa as setting and backdrop, which eliminates the African as human factor. Africa and Africans are mere props and literary devices. The so-called barbarity of the colonizing European is critiqued, yet it is the racist notion of the inherent barbarity of Africa and Africans which is deployed to do so. It is not the differentness that worries Conrad, but the lurking hint of kinship, of common ancestry, Achebe says. The civilized European is superior, yes, but at his core he is barbaric like his inferior African relative. Of course, Joseph Conrad didn't originate these ideas or these literary and narrative techniques, but what's so interesting about him is that he undercuts his own ostensibly anti-imperialist text by reinforcing the very ideology that imperialism hinges on: racism. Coppola's acclaimed film takes similar conceits and places them in the context of the Vietnam War, where Captain Willard travels downriver to assassinate the renegade Colonel Kurtz. Willard, like Marlowe, operates as a narrator, with the film often reflecting his visual perspective through filmic techniques, and more obviously including his voiceover to narrate parts of the story. Willard reflects on the hypocrisy of the US military to accuse and assassinate someone for murder, when serving in the Vietnam War makes them all murderers, and the film offers a powerful exploration of that hypocrisy, but ultimately it does use Vietnam, Cambodia, and Southeast Asian people in the same way as Conrad. A striking image of the little kingdom over which Kurtz is god, guarded by Southeast Asians smothered in white paint, offers a striking image about the constructedness of whiteness, but equally about the futility of a racialized person's attempt to appear civilized, i.e. white. Meanwhile, as they descend into psychological darkness, Kurtz, and indeed Willard himself when he murders Kurtz, both become black, covered in black paint or draped in shadow or visually paralleled to black animals. When whiteness, representing purity and civility, is stripped away, all that's left is the blackness of human nature. This imagery is of course highly racially charged and disturbing in what it has to say about the barbaric and evil nature of racialized people. Both stories may say that white people are just as barbaric on the inside, but it still implies their superiority. Harvard-educated Kurtz is a more attractive vision of whiteness than the Southeast Asian body smothered in white paint. The racially encoded imagery of whiteness as good, pure, and civil versus darkness and blackness as evil and barbaric has been around in Western literature and film for at least as long as Empire, and it should always be interrogated. There are interesting subversions of this in the poetry and essays of Audre Lorde, who instead configures whiteness as violent and lovingly revitalizes darkness as a place of depth, warmth, beauty, and familiarity. Spec Ops: The Line speaks back to military first-person shooters using similar narrative techniques. The city of Dubai is a mere backdrop. Walker moves deeper into the city as he moves deeper into his own mind, just like Willard's journey across the Nung River into Cambodia, and just like Marlowe's along the Congo River mimic Kurtz and their own journeys into darkness. In The Line, like in these texts, racialized people are rendered voiceless, and the violence inflicted upon their bodies is meant to invoke pity in the white reader/viewer/player, but not enough to humanize them. Now, while I intend on doing a deep dive into the topic of Orientalism in games in another video, I have been talking about it a bit without specifically using that word, and I'm going to bring it back a bit now. In the context of the military shooter, Johan Höglund notes that Orientalism essentially conjures an imaginary space, a space that finally produces the East in the minds of a Western audience, and this ideological work has deeply material consequences. It means that American Neo-Orientalism appears to justify and even encourage and produce American military and economic practices in the Middle East. This is essentially what I've been saying when I claim that dehumanizing portrayals of Arabs in games is used to justify wars. I've discussed some of the techniques that are used to racialize and dehumanize NPCs, but what about the space of the Arab city itself? This seems deeply important to look at, especially considering the line's inspirational material, both of which use landscapes to convey something deeply symbolic. Matthew Gault observes that in Call of Duty Modern Warfare, in the minds of most Americans, the Forever War exists in a nebulous country over there. We're fighting in Afghanistan, the Middle East, and North Africa, but all these places are treated as interchangeable. This can arguably be explained somewhat by Stephen Graham's analysis in Cities and the War on Terror, where he argues that Arab cities have been long represented by Western powers as dark, exotic, labyrinthine, and structureless places that need to be unveiled for the production of order through the ostensibly superior scientific, planning, and military technologies of the occupying West. Therefore, as long as the Arab city is Arab, it is a site of perpetual war. As Hoagland notes, this is a convenient narrative which justifies conflict when in fact it is in the interest of government that certain wars do not stop. Not only does a perpetual war fuel a nation's war industry indefinitely, it also allows the beleaguered nation to believe that the hostile, but never finally defined, other is being perpetually contained. It normalizes the US's presence in the Middle East and implies that this is essential to maintaining the stability and security of the US, which, as we've discussed, was part of Bush's narrative to justify invading Afghanistan and Iraq in the first place. Now, if the gamer involved in a military shooter set in the Middle East is forever performing the strategic containment of the other, what of the line, the shooter about shooters? The line, in my view, by following in Conrad and Coppola's footsteps, only continues to use the Arab city as a prop, as a background, as a symbolic place of darkness. The Arab city, just as the Arab people, are stripped of their reality, their history, their depth, and their specificity. The line continues to use Arabs and their homes as mere ideological battlefields. It's strange that the game chooses Dubai as its Arab city. Personally, I'm not totally sure what to make of it, but I offer KO's reading, which I do find compelling. Arguably, the United Arab Emirates Dubai is seen as the West's foot in the door into the Middle East, or at least capitalism's foot in the door. It's a Middle Eastern city where Westerners can feel safe, at home, like this is different from the rest of the Arab world. Dubai is a city that we look at and we understand. But in the line, the sands of that very Arabic world that terrifies the West have engulfed and destroyed Dubai, taking an entire battalion of US troops with it. Against the encroachment of the West, the world, at least the natural world, has fought back. Perhaps Dubai represents the barbaric Arab pretending to be the civilized white man. Perhaps this is where the white man confronts his barbarism for that very reason. Interesting that city is wrecked by natural disasters, distorting who is to blame. Meanwhile, references to Walker and Conrad's past service in Afghanistan, invoking real events and real violence, and invoking a very different Arab city, is barely discussed. An infuriating detail when reading KO's critique of the line was his insistence on referring to the racialized people of Dubai as Arabic. Arabic refers to a language, while Arab is a term which refers to the broad range of people encompassing many ethnic groups connected by their shared use of the Arabic language. I have used the term Emirati to designate more specifically the country that these people are from, the United Arab Emirates. The use of the term Arab is useful because it invokes a particular racialization of Arab people in the Western imagination. Specifically the post-9/11 racialization at play in these games, of Arabs as dangerous, terrorist Islamic fundamentalists. But it irked me to no end, reading all 50,000 words of this, that an author could take such lengths to research and write about a game, but couldn't even do a quick Google search to use the appropriate designation for the racialized people represented in the game. KO does offer a reading of the racial and colonial dynamics in the line. He observes that early in the game, the enemy NPCs are as typically othered as in any other military shooter by virtue of the fact that they are Arabic. They wear scarves over their faces, they speak in a language that many players won't understand. I agree with the point, but of course the terms in which it's being made are troubling. First, the misuse of Arabic, which I won't point out again. Next, the non-specificity of the scarf, which I referred to the deep historical, cultural, and political significance of earlier. Finally, the point about language, which reveals the writer's assumptions about the player and reinforces who the implied player of the line is. KO goes on. Of course, it is worth noting that while the enemies I face become less othered as the game proceeds, The Arabic people are never less othered themselves, but merely replaced with more relatable Western enemies, more relatable to a Western audience at least. On one hand, this is certainly problematic. Nothing that the line does works to de-otherize Arabic people so dramatically othered in other shooters and media more broadly. But on the other hand, by replacing them with US soldiers halfway through the game, the line forces the player to realize they have always been, shooting humans. How many players draw that connection back to consider the insurgents of the early levels as human, however, is questionable. There is one small nod to the human nature of these Dubai natives, however. Right at the start, right after I shoot my first person, Lugo asks who these people are, and Adams notes that they are refugees. I agree with the point, if not the generally persisting assumption about who the player is. The player, of course, must be a white man who speaks English, who considers shared language, whiteness, maleness, and speaking English to be inherently human qualities, while brownness and speaking Arabic are inherently alien, inhuman qualities. To me, Arabic is familiar. It's my mother's language. It reminds me of the place where I was born. To me, brown skin reminds me of my family and many of my friends. To me, a kufiyya is not simply a scarf, it is a symbol of solidarity and resistance. K.O. goes on, delivering the lines which were perhaps most painful for me to read. Simply changing the human NPCs I am shooting to an ethnicity that more closely reflects my own is a startlingly powerful way to force me to acknowledge the humanity of the targets I'm shooting. You don't have to be a consciously racist person to more easily other people whose languages and cultures you don't understand. It's human nature to do so. As the orders being screamed by the enemies are suddenly in English, suddenly understandable to me, I instantly realized just how much I had othered the insurgents before now. If it were human nature to other people whose experiences and cultures we don't understand, I promise you I wouldn't see white people as human. But I was raised on a media diet that showed me that only white people were allowed to be human, so I've always humanized people who never saw my humanity. I was conditioned to, we all were. K.O.'s whiteness and his refusal to take responsibility for this whiteness is dehumanizing to me as a reader of his criticism. It's deeply painful for me to read about this man's personal journey of coming to see representations of people like me in video games as human beings, because he just hadn't thought about it before. And this is the problem with the line. This is the problem with Heart of Darkness, with Apocalypse Now, at their core. These are stories which ostensibly critique imperialism but use our homes, our cultures, our bodies as props to center white suffering. Look how painful this violence is to the man who created it. At the end of the day, it isn't my pain which the line makes visible. It's my corpse. Speaking of corpses, what better way to talk racialized bodies than 2009's Resident Evil with its, African zombies? Capcom's Resident Evil, known in its Japanese homeland as Biohazard, features in many people's earliest horror game experiences. The first RE game was released on the PlayStation in 1996, and since then it's seen 8 main installments, a few remakes, and several film and television spin-offs. Zombie and body horror is at the core of this series, which follows various characters in their battle against Umbrella Corporation, a pharmaceutical company developing biological weapons that turn people, plants, and animals into zombies and other bulbous creatures. Early in the series, an outbreak in the fictional Raccoon City is contained by a government missile strike, but further outbreaks in Spain, Africa, and Eastern Europe take our characters across the world in their war against bioweapons. Recent installments have pivoted away from the more action-oriented early installments, offering ordinary, unarmed playable characters in favor of the early series' trigger-happy cops. By the time we get to Resident Evil 5, Umbrella Corporation has been shut down for its development of biological weapons, and other pharmaceutical companies have funded a global anti-terrorist unit to prevent bioweapons from being produced and distributed. named the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, or BSAA. In RE5, you play as Chris Redfield, formerly a member of Raccoon City Police Department's Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS, now an agent of the BSAA, so a domestic cop turned world cop. Chris is sent to unnamed African country, which the cast of course simply refers to as Africa, where he teams up with an African BSAA agent named Sheva, who intends to help Chris gain the trust of the local Africans. Chris and Sheva are supposed to apprehend a man named Irving who intends to sell biological weapons, but when they arrive, the locals have already become infected by a zombie virus. They chase Irving through an oil field and kill him after he turns himself into an enormous flesh monster, but his last words lead them underground, where they learn that Umbrella was developing viruses from flowers, including a strain named Ouroboros. They discover that Tricell, a company funding the BSAA, took over Umbrella's research in this underground lab and plans to launch missiles with the Ouroboros virus across the globe. The main antagonist, Wesker, intends to use Ouroboros as an ethnic cleansing tool, and to save a chosen few in order to create a new breed of humanity. Of course, Chris and Sheva defeat Wesker and prevent nuclear and biological apocalypse. The neo-colonial dynamics are immediately clear and have been explored by numerous critics of the game. Paul Martin summarizes this argument for me so that I don't have to. RE5's story is about a multinational corporation, Umbrella, coming into a post-colonial country and continuing the structures of colonialism that existed before independence through economic rather than military or political exploitation. White masculinity stands for modernity. Undifferentiated black African bodies stand for an ambivalent pre-modern nature/tradition that is equal parts threatening savage and victim in need of salvation by the white hero, Chris. But I want to unpack the fear held in the infected body of the racialized barbaric other a little further. Takax points out that President Bush's use of language in the 2000s characterized terrorists as evildoers and used pestilential metaphors to dehumanize the enemy, for example describing Osama bin Laden as a parasite who feeds off weakness and is determined to spread chaos like a plague throughout the world. While parasites and evildoers in this context are generally aligned with the racialization of a violent, invasive Muslim/Arab other, the use of parasitic imagery to imagine racial others is not uncommon. In the UK, in recent memory, politicians have described their fear of migrants coming in swarms to invade our shores and infect our way of life. And as Takax elaborates, the frame resonated because it drew upon a history of both political and popular discourse in the United States. The conflation of difference and danger has been central to the formation and maintenance of American identity. In Resident Evil 5, most enemy NPCs are racialized Africans become zombies. The only human Africans we encounter in the game are Sheva, relegated to the role of sidekick and misogynistic eye candy, notably light-skinned and straight-haired, and briefly her mentor Captain Stone, though I'm pretty sure he died. Clearly a memorable character. The gameplay in RE5 relies somewhat on the partnership between Chris and Sheva, but you never play as Sheva. Sheva exists in a support role to carry your stuff and follow your orders.
I am sworn to carry your burdens.
Sheva and Stone are clearly American aligned as they're both members of the BSAA, and Sheva both follows Chris and falls, albeit on its margins, into the scope of white American beauty standards. These are the Africans that are afforded a little humanity, but not much agency. Their fellow countrymen infected by the zombie virus are reduced to walking representations of the parasitic racialized other, even though Chris and the BSAA are, by all means, the ones encroaching on their land. And of course, it's our job to shoot and kill these monstrous Africans. Strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, the African zombies are both monsters and victims, as the real evil is the white Wesker's eugenicist scheme, and Tricell, the BSAA's corporate funders. It is the Westerners, not the Africans, who possess the world-ending nuclear and biological weapons with the intent of ethnic cleansing. but Africans have no role, no agency, no humanity in the story of their own exploitation and destruction. RE's romanticization of military and police protagonists like Chris still obscures a meaningful critique of the US military-industrial complex. But Resident Evil 5 is a Japanese game. This is an important context which creates further racial and colonial meanings. It is certainly true that developers have referred explicitly to their intent to appeal to Western audiences, including using Hollywood films as inspirational material. But the game also has a Japanese market, and no doubt its Japanese developers brought their own unconscious as well as conscious ideas about race, colonialism, and power into their work. Paul Martin makes two arguments about how this plays out in RE5. Regarding race, he claims that the game puts into play Japanese conceptions of race, particularly as it relates to Japanese self-fashioning with respect to whiteness and blackness. I read the game's racial politics in terms of a Japanese hybridity, where Japanese racial identity is located as neither black nor white, and this is related to the supposed essential Japanese ability to take in, adapt, and control foreign cultural influences. Blackness is both symbolic of the other, but also a source of identification in that it is, like the Japanese subject position, non-white. To Martin, the half-French, half-Japanese character Jill Valentine represents this liminal space, analogous to the Japanese neither black nor white racial position. While both Africans and white Americans succumb to the virus when infected, Jill's ability to take in, control, and overpower the foreign bodies represented by the virus can be read in terms of her Japanese identity. From within Japanese racial discourse, Jill's infection pulls her in two directions at once, towards a whiteness represented by her changed skin and hair color, and a blackness based on racist stereotypes of strength and aggressiveness. However, she is ultimately able to control these pressures on her identity. Beyond the level of narrative and content, the player's subjectivity is implicated in these complex racialized power struggles. When reading games, there's always the issue of what Espen Arseth calls the implied player, a term I've used a few times already, which produces a game and its meaning. According to Martin, this implied player has a particular shape, determined by common sense understandings of what a player is, and of the range of pleasures, desires, skills, and knowledges players have. Some of these understandings are the results of conscious research and decision-making processes on the part of designers, but the implied player also enters the game through common sense understandings that are not consciously held or deliberately implemented, understandings that are part of the wider social imaginary through which the game is created. In most of the games we've looked at, the implied player is a white male, most likely American, almost certainly cis-heterosexual, though this essay hasn't deeply explored the gendered aspects of neocolonialism and militarism. Boyfriends that slay together do stay together. Implied players are constructed in all sorts of ways through the content of the game, narrative and gameplay, as well as paratexts, so stuff external to the game itself, like marketing materials. Martin argues that the implied Japanese player both identifies with and resists white subjectivity. While there are many ways in which the white male protagonist is configured as the subject to the African objects, Martin argues that by controlling Chris's avatar, this opens a space for the non-white male player to experience being a white male subjectivity, exercising control over black and female bodies, both those of the zombies and of Sheva. But it also opens up a space for this player to experience, from a non-white subject position, control over the white male body of Chris. As such, if the implied player is Japanese, the game constructs an implied player that performs an imagined reversal of the US-Japan colonial relationship. Japan as a nation also occupies a liminal space as a colonial nation and a colonized nation. It has previously enjoyed a colonial and occupying relationship with other Asian countries, particularly China, Korea, and parts of Southeast Asia, and to some degree Japan still does enjoy colonial control, though from a non-Japanese perspective we're encouraged to see the Japanese as a homogeneous racial and ethnic group. In fact, the indigenous Ainu people of northern Hokkaido don't consider themselves Japanese, but have been forced to assimilate into Japan due to fear of Russian invasion. The people of the southern island of Okinawa also do not consider themselves Japanese, having been colonized by Japan due to pressures from the US. Both the Ainu and the Okinawans have been forced to speak Japanese, and their languages and cultures have been attacked. After World War II, Japan was stripped of its territories in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia, and occupied by the US and its allies from 1945 to 1952. The US imposed a new constitution on Japan featuring Article 9, which stipulated that Japan was not allowed to have a military or to pursue war as a solution to international conflicts. However, as the Cold War began, the US quickly pursued a reverse course in its policies, shifting its focus from weakening Japan to strengthening it as a potential ally in the Cold War. Labor unions and communist activity was criminalized, conservative policies were reinstated, and the Japanese self-defense forces were formed. A precondition of US withdrawal was an agreement to a US-Japan security treaty, which allowed the US to maintain forces on Japanese soil and lock Japan into neo-colonial subjugation by the US. Strides towards remilitarization have been made since the War on Terror. In 2004, the government breached Article 9 by deploying troops to Iraq to support the US, and in 2006, the Japanese Ministry of Defense was formed. Within Japan, remilitarization continues to be a hotly debated topic. On one hand, Article 9 has been an impediment to Japan developing as a global neo-colonial power in its own right in the post-war period, but on the other hand, it's kept them largely safe from the Cold War. There are also those who believe Japan should pay reparations for its colonial past, and those who believe it should never have to apologize. It's these issues which are at play in media which Westerners love to consume uncritically and fetishistically, from the more conservative, pro-military Attack on Titan to the more challenging Full Metal Alchemist. In RE5, Martin argues, the implied player rehearses a form of colonialism as normalized international behavior. This structure allows for a particular form of memory in a Japanese context, one in which a colonial past that cannot speak its name, at least not in a major commercial game bound for international markets, is transformed into a normalized way of being Japanese under a mandated global entity, the UN-sponsored BSAA. In other words, while the implied American player enacts the neo-colonial power fantasies which are true to America's actual position as a global neo-colonial power, the implied Japanese player enacts an imperial fantasy as if Japan were a global neo-colonial power as well. Now, I don't feel like I can talk about war games without talking about Metal Gear, a AAA series infamous for its anti-war slant. Created by Hideo Kojima, developed and published by the Japanese conglomerate Konami, the first Metal Gear game was released in 1987. Fans of the series have extensive knowledge of hard-to-follow lore that I won't claim to totally have a grasp of, but I picked up a Metal Gear game for the first time to write this essay, and I get it. Whether or not it's your cup of tea, it's unique and interesting and very, very complex. The game I picked for this essay was Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, released in 2015. In MGS5, you play as an individual known by the codenames Naked Snake or Big Boss. Big Boss used to work for a US Special Forces unit called Fox, but parted ways with the military and founded a private mercenary company called Militaires Sans Frontières, an ironic nod, most likely, to the real-life Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. In the MGS5 prequel, Ground Zeroes, Big Boss is deployed to rescue 2 prisoners from an American military base in Cuba, but this is revealed as a ruse, a distraction while his enemies attack MSF's mother base. Big Boss is caught in an explosion and falls into a 9-year coma before he wakes in the year 1984 on a British military base in Cyprus. This is when the Phantom Pain begins. Big Boss is recruited to lead a new mercenary group called the Diamond Dogs. Venom Snake is the new codename he adopts as he is deployed in Kabul in Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War, then in the Angola-Zaire region during the Angolan Civil War. So, while there is a sizable serving of bizarre, internally ambivalent elements in MGS5, from the chicken hat to Quiet's apparent need to be naked to breathe through her skin, to Kojima putting himself in an otherwise forgettable side mission, the Phantom Pain also features 2 neo-colonial wars that really did happen. As the game unfolds, you can access cassette tapes which provide information, conversations between characters, and more. The tapes which explain the political and historical context in Afghanistan and Angola-Zaire particularly do so in my opinion, an unsatisfactory way. For example, the erasure of Palestine and the obfuscation of the so-called Arab-Israeli conflict in imperialist propaganda terms. This is indicative of a strange tension in the Phantom Pain. On one hand, it critiques US hegemony and justifies the violence that Venom Snake and the Diamond Dogs employ in order to stop Cypher. On the other hand, it frames all violence as natural and inevitable, and views all violence as equal. As I've claimed in my exploration of justice in games, and as many before me have said, the violence of the oppressor and the violence of the oppressed are not the same. In the Angola-Zaire border region, your main enemy NPCs are the Contract Forces of Africa, or CFA, a private military group with close ties to the US-backed UNITA. The plot you uncover there pertains to a company called South African Natural Resources, or SANER, which owns the Mafinda oil field, and which is eventually revealed to be a front for the American intelligence agency Cypher. The CIA does exist in the Metal Gear universe, but Cypher is comparable to them. Its bizarre supernatural twin, one might say. Neo-colonialism at its funkiest. In Kabul, your main enemy NPCs are the Soviet occupying army. Many NPCs in both locations are white, Russian Soviets in Afghanistan, and British and Dutch colonists in Africa, with the exception of native Africans who work for the CFA, or are embroiled in the Civil War, manipulated and fed by neo-colonial interests. In Afghanistan, many but not all of your missions are concerned with assisting the Mujahideen, which of course is a complex position. While the Mujahideen are US-backed, they are a native population resisting an occupying regime. As much as Western anti-Soviet propaganda is rooted in broad anti-communism, there is no denying the violent legacy of Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In any case, Venom Snake is active in these regions during these neo-colonial proxy wars, initially searching for the truth behind the explosion 9 years ago. What he unearths is not 1, not 2, but at least 3 interconnected plots by Cypher and its factions. As I mentioned, Cypher is an American intelligence agency linked to DARPA and the Pentagon. In the Metal Gear universe, it was co-founded by a man named Zero who wants to subjugate the world to its control. In the Phantom Pain, Cypher intends to develop a model of the titular Metal Gear system, a bipedal weapon used for nuclear warfare, called Sahelanthropus. Meanwhile, Skullface, the leader of a rogue Cypher faction named XOF, quietly rebels against Cypher because their vision for world peace is about imposing American language and culture on the entire world. So, an anti-imperialist king, right? Well, it's complicated. Skullface's solution to American cultural imperialism is to cultivate a bioweapon, a strain of so-called vocal cord parasites, which kill anyone who speaks English. This parasite was originally developed by Cypher in order to target people who didn't speak English, a virus they literally called the ethnic cleanser, but they abandoned this plan. Skullface subverts the plan, calling his parasite the Liberator. This is already clearly a problem considering how many racialized people live in diaspora and don't know their ancestral languages, or how many natives were forced by colonists to speak English. For example, I would probably be killed by this so-called liberator parasite because English is my first language. These tensions are somewhat explored through the character of Code Talker, a Diné, or Navajo, scientist. The name Code Talker is a reference to Diné, who developed codes for the US during World War II using Diné Bizard, the Navajo language, pointing to the irony of instrumentalizing the very language that was suppressed as part of the settler colonial project in order to win the war. The character Code Talker initially works for Skullface because his vitriol for the English language is rooted in his own community's experience of settler colonial violence, particularly the suppression of native languages and cultures through the reservation school system. Skullface himself is angry and vengeful because of his own experience as a child in Soviet-occupied Hungary, witnessing the use of cultural imperialism and of language as a tool of control. But Skullface's plan is flawed because language is only a tool of US imperialism. Eradicating the English language might deal a blow, but it won't eradicate imperialist systems of control. Just as the US rose as the leading imperialist power after the World War, they might only be displaced by another colonizer. Similarly, Code Talker's solutions do not seem to address the structures of settler colonialism, and a glaring issue with his understanding of the very system which oppresses him is revealed when he makes reference to saving the Diné bloodline. In our video on settler colonialism, we talked about blood quantum and how this colonial ideology delegitimizes native sovereignty and systems of tribal membership. And the Phantom Pain's token, thoroughly sexually objectified female character Quiet is implied to be Diné when she speaks Diné Bizard with Code Talker, so bonus points for that horrific objectification of Native American women. Simultaneously, Skullface uses Code Talker to research an organism called metallic archaea, which metabolizes uranium-235 in order to produce weapons-grade uranium. Again, he manipulates Code Talker's original motive for researching these organisms, which is to counteract the irradiation experienced by Diné, forced by American settlers to work in uranium mines. Interestingly, Code Talker points out that the uranium mines in the US closed when it became cheaper to source uranium abroad, indicating an international continuum between the racialized violence experienced by Native Americans under settler colonialism and the racialized violence faced by Africans due to neocolonialism. This way, Skullface hopes to sell what are essentially mini-nuclear weapons worldwide, using the threat of Sahelanthropus to encourage purchases. I guess because nuclear deterrence equals world peace or something. In any case, Skullface's activity in terms of mining and exploiting Africa for natural resources in order to develop nuclear weapons is, well, it's neocolonial as heck. Skullface is killed and Venom Snake defeats Sahelanthropus, and at this point it seemed like the game was gonna end, but there was more. The game finally does end with the revelation that Venom Snake is not, in fact, Big Boss, but a medic who was caught in the same explosion. During his coma, plastic surgery and hypnotherapy were used to transform the medic into a decoy for the real Big Boss. This is so offensive to one of Big Boss's companions, Miller, that when he finds out, he vows to support Venom Snake instead and seek revenge on the real Big Boss. YouTuber Michael Saba compellingly argues that MGS5 holds a dark mirror to America and provides a powerful critique of militarism, emphasizing player freedom in its gameplay while revealing this freedom to be an illusion. The player encounters many mirror images, the dialogue stresses the theme of duality, and the two-part structure of the story builds to a heroic and triumphant victory, which is then followed by a denouement which unsettles its initial foundations. The legend established in Chapter 1 is broken down. We repeat missions, Venom Snake's companions gradually leave or are exiled, he has to shoot many of his own men, in an apocalyptic visual mirror of the prologue, and finally it reveals that we are a phantom fighting a phantom enemy. We are doomed to a proxy war without end, as the game phrases it, or a perpetual war as we might also call it. Perhaps most interestingly, you, the player, are Venom Snake. The game encourages you to put your own name in at the start, though this reveal feels a little dissonant if you, like me, are not a man. In any case, you are the villain, the final boss at the end of the game that started it all, 1987's Metal Gear. You're just a pawn fighting somebody else's war, making somebody else rich, and the real big boss is a villain in his own right for these horrific actions, coming to exploit his own men exactly the way he was exploited by the US Army. Saba argues that MGS5 can be seen as an allegory for 9/11 and the War on Terror, with the prequel Ground Zeroes establishing the destruction of the original Mother Base, and Chapter 1 of The Phantom Pain, entitled Revenge, establishing the heroic legend of Big Boss seeking out vengeance for this act, while Chapter 2 deconstructs the fallacy behind this legend and concludes that war only creates more war. But he also argues that MGS5 is a treatise against remilitarization in Japan. It's a fantastic close reading of the game which helped me appreciate Chapter 2, so I definitely recommend watching it. But while Saba points briefly to the fact that MGS5 is based in the resource-rich regions of Afghanistan and Angola Zaire to emphasize the ways these lands and these people are pawns for maximizing profit, it fails to address my main critique of MGS5, which is more or less the same political critique I have of The Line and of its foundational texts. It seems that mainstream anti-war texts are always to be told from the perspective of white men and to center white suffering. In The Phantom Pain, an obvious theme is loss, the things that haunt soldiers like Venom Snake and Miller. Their lost limbs and the phantom pain they feel are used as a metaphor for psychological trauma, and many characters on all sides are driven by their own desire for vengeance and their own phantom pain. And yeah, it's a little yikesy the way that Skullface's disfigurement plays into the disfigured villain trope, and that alongside both Miller and Venom Snake's amputations, it plays into the use of physical impairments as metaphors rather than physical realities. But the theme that for soldiers there are always lines that must be crossed, that you can't go home again, that you'll always be haunted, these are of course themes in The Line as well. Like The Line, The Phantom Pain insists that there is nowhere to go but further on this path. Venom Snake and many of the characters in this game have no choice but to be weapons, because that is what they are. Of course, the objectifying use of weapons is interesting, implying that soldiers are mere pawns in a bigger game, indiscrete replaceable parts in a broader mechanism of violence and power. This becomes especially stark when we realize that Venom Snake was conditioned against his will to believe he was Big Boss. A stark representation, one could argue, of the way that soldiers are not born, but made. It's a theme that carries in other aspects of the Metal Gear universe, as Big Boss not only has a phantom in Venom Snake, he also has two sons, Solid Snake and Liquid Snake, that are actually his clones. There's an element of powerlessness, of the inability to make a choice, but there are also clear junctures in which choices are made. When Miller chooses to reject Big Boss's callous actions, or when Big Boss himself, way back when, rejected the US Army. But the choice is always to fight violence with the same violence. It's never the choice to change, to try to be something different. And to be clear, when I say the same violence, I mean the same violence. Not the violence of resistance, not the violence of the oppressed, the violence of the oppressor. This is the hypocrisy of Big Boss et al., that they replicate the violent structures they oppose. These tensions become apparent in the dialogue, narrative, and gameplay as well. They don't belong to any nation, yet they are a nation. Despite vocal opposition to nuclear weapons and an anti-nuclear theme running throughout the Metal Gear series, once metallic archaea is discovered, the player is given the option to buy their own nuclear weapons. They oppose US imperialism, critiquing big business for developed countries and understanding the Angolan Civil War as just a microcosm of what's happening in Africa, yet the gameplay involves purchasing territorial waters and establishing the Diamond Dog's own military bases there. In other words, in neo-colonial fashion, using their superior military and economic power to encroach on others' land. They describe themselves as free of ideology, but of course no one is free of ideology, even if they don't proclaim to have one. The practice, if not the thoughts and words of the Diamond Dogs, certainly reflect imperialist ideology. Military shooter and stealth gameplay is coupled with the sort of expansionist systems you find in games like Mass Effect 3 or Dragon Age Inquisition. When it comes to intervening in the Soviet-Afghan War, the Angolan Civil War, and other world affairs, as you do when you deploy Diamond Dog's units into combat, the mercenary company's approach is simple. They're a private military force, so they help whoever pays. This includes NGOs, the UN, vaguely designated Western countries, rebels and insurgents, you name it. When you navigate these cities and regions, you see nothing but military camps and enemy NPCs, child soldiers, and victims. There are no subjects, only objects. There is no life, only war. A land without a people. Your playground. Furthermore, you can deploy your troops across the global south to do what the game itself explicitly calls resource exploitation, one of the main goals of neocolonialism. In some tapes, Miller even accidentally reveals to Code Talker that Diamond Dogs are producing hamburgers possibly to embezzle money, all while ironically musing on the hamburger as the symbol of American capitalism. Recruitment for the Diamond Dogs is an interesting affair too. You generally knock out your enemies and use a magic balloon to send them back to Mother Base, extracting them against their will. Often, even if you recruit someone as part of a mission and not as a random encounter with a random enemy NPC, it's because they have no other choice. A classic technique of military recruitment to target those who are vulnerable and have few other choices. At the same time, the Phantom Pain feels the need to include a narrative about African soldiers which frames Venom Snake et al. As white saviors, when, in a broad sense, as I've described, Diamond Dogs are meddling and profiting off the conflict in the region just as much as the British, Dutch, and Americans are. As part of this plot, we encountered Liquid Snake as a child, not just any child, but a white British child who is leading the native African child soldiers, because, of course, black children cannot lead themselves. Ultimately, these children all leave Mother Base to return to their homes, but in leaving Venom Snake's hypocritical saviorism, they pledge themselves once more to a white boy's leadership. Venom Snake and friends lament that they wanted to show these boys another way than war. But how could they when war is all they do? How could they when they are one of the neocolonial powers that feed off of this very war? This is one of the only vaguely human encounters with racialized people in this game. Afghan people are largely not present in Afghanistan except for the occasional mission where we're rescuing prisoners, and they're certainly never anything more than objects. In Angola Zaire, our encounters with black Africans include the enemy NPCs we're killing, knocking out or recruiting against their will, as well as various sequences which uncomfortably seem to revel in mutilated, possessed, and suffering black bodies. In the end, ironically, it's the Diamond Dog's weapon developer who says it best as he's exiled from Mother Base.
Open your eyes! What you're doing is murder! Plain and simple! All you ever create is war! War and violence can never lead to peace!
In the first part of my analysis, I discussed some of the ways in which neocolonial ideologies and production chains are normalized in the AAA scene, by contrasting Call of Duty Modern Warfare and Call of Duty Ghosts with the deliciously playful Saints Row 4. In part 2, I looked at Spec Ops: The Line, Resident Evil 5, and MGS 5, breaking down the ways in which the anti-imperialist messages are undercut by racist logics, which instrumentalize racialized bodies and exotic cities to tell stories about white suffering. The Line, of course, is a deadly serious game, while MGS 5 is, shall we say, tonally ambivalent. Amanda Hudgens, for example, argues that the Phantom Pain sabotages its own depth by playing everything straight, by presenting real-world horror alongside events no less ridiculous than, say, a humpback whale made of fire eating a helicopter. Indeed, while I really enjoyed Michael Saba's analysis of MGS5 as an anti-war game, if its racial and gender politics go unaddressed, so largely does its ridiculousness. I think Hudgens is right to point out that there's a tension here, though I personally don't know that MGS5 is without cynicism. I do struggle to read the moments of ridiculousness that permeate this, by all means, very sincere game. Is the chicken hat, and furthermore the little chicken hat, a playful critique of masculine gaming cultures, marking you out as a chicken if you dare to fail repeatedly, or worse, to desire an accessible gaming experience? Is the ridiculous supernatural explanation for Quiet's nakedness a subtle critique of the objectification of women in gaming? I don't know. I think for something to meaningfully subvert expectations, as we've explored, it has to offer multiple points of view. But if another way to view Big Boss is given, there's no other way to view Quiet, really, or any other way to view racialized people and their lands, which aren't really theirs. As for the chicken hat, who knows? I just really wanted to play on easy mode. Todd Harper in the wonderful blog Saintception argues that Saints Row 4 is a game about games about games. He says this exactly because he wants to contrast it to one of AAA gaming's most tired rhetorical stingers in the past few years. The "it was you the whole time" bit, the Spec Ops style "you were complicit in this tragedy from minute one" nonsense. He finds these to be dull because they don't offer any other alternatives for engaging them. And I wouldn't say I found the line entirely dull, but yeah, I totally see where he's coming from. What's unique about the way that Saints throws its video gameness in our face is that you're not a hero, but you're not a villain. You're a puckish rogue. If the line and MGS5 want us to feel bad, want us to feel responsible and complicit, but refuse to meaningfully confront the responsibility or complicity of the developer or present any alternatives, at least Saints, for Harper, creates a playful sense of mutuality. Saints Row 4, for him, says, we share this understanding of the limitations of the simulation, that we are equally complicit in my submission to it. He concludes that perhaps this encourages us to have hope that this experience that we as critics have come to dread is not necessarily all bad. It is a game that says a certain degree of freedom within that structure can be meaningful. A certain degree of freedom within the structure can be meaningful. I love this reading. If the implied player of The Line and MGS5 is a white man, I think the implied player of Saints Row is a little more ambivalent. It feels, when I play it, like maybe it could have been made with me in mind. This comes back to a critique which has been made broadly of satire, a critique which points out limitations, sure, but which I don't consider all bad by any stretch. That is, that for satire to work, the consumer has to share the tacit political leaning of the artist. In other words, Saints Row 4 only works if you're already critical of games, of state power, of violence and war and Islamophobia and imperialism and racism. So yeah, that is a game that feels like I was meant to play it. With all of this said, I must struggle to come to a neat conclusion about these messy games and their messy themes. These games, in different ways, rely on or play on the idea of the player as a controlling subject. There's a certain implied player that we begin with. Repeatedly, the conclusion is that there is only so much control we have within systems which, by their very nature, preclude control. But perhaps we have a certain degree of freedom in the system through our playful submission to it. Perhaps these small freedoms are the first steps towards reimagining and rebuilding systems in their entirety. The truth is that we are not individually responsible for the state of the world, nor can we, as individuals, save it. Maybe there are no heroes. But as these various games and their various approaches to the problem show, we can make different games. We can make challenging games. We can play games in challenging ways. And we can do it together. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a like and be sure to comment. As always, a huge thank you to our patrons who make videos like this possible. We genuinely couldn't do this without you. If you aren't a patron already, please consider supporting us over at patreon.com/GameAssistYT. Catch us over on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for further discussions and conversations, and as always, thank you for watching. Take care.